Hey everyone, I wanted to talk to you today about um, the Darwinian dilemma for moral realism. Uh, your author, Russ Schaefer Landau, is himself a moral realist of a particular variety, what's sometimes called a non naturalist moral realist. Um, and we're going to be discussing an argument against moral realism. Um, this argument comes to us from Sharon Street, philosopher at NYU, and she frames it as a dilemma. And the dilemma arises as a result of some recent evolutionary hypotheses about the origins of moral cognition and moral thinking in human beings. I think a good place to start is to lay out a few common moral beliefs. These are not, universal, but I think it's fair to say that um, these are quite commonly held across cultures and throughout time. Um, and they're also relatively basic. So you guys in moral theory have been discussing um, uh, sort of general moral theories. You've been discussing controversial examples of moral beliefs. These are relatively less controversial and relatively foundational moral beliefs, and these are here are just a handful of them. We're morally required to help our children. It's morally right to help those who help you. Being altruistic is morally praiseworthy. Um, you should, or we should, as a society, punish those who deliberately harm others. Contrast those common moral beliefs with uh, a, a different set of moral beliefs that are very uncommon. Fortunately, almost no one holds these. We're morally required to hurt our own children, or it's morally wrong to help those who help you. Um, Being altruistic is morally blameworthy. Or how about this one? You should reward those who deliberately harm others. Fortunately, very few people have ever held beliefs on this second list, and they're certainly not widespread. Um, Sharon Street's Darwinian dilemma, the way to think about it, is she begins with a question. And the question is, well, why is it that we human beings hold beliefs like the ones on the first list and not as much the beliefs like the one on the second list? And her why question here is really a causal why. So what she wants to know is what's sometimes called a genealogy or a causal historical explanation for how it is and why it is across time that human beings have tended to converge on beliefs like you should always help your children and not beliefs like you should always harm your children. The basic assumption she begins with, and that I think is very plausible, is the following what we'll call evolutionary assumption. And the evolutionary assumption says, broadly speaking, the answer to the question of why we tend to believe that um, we are obligated to help our children is that evolutionary forces across many generations um, endowed our ancestors with well, first, the capacity for moral thinking at all, that is, the ability to think in terms of right and wrong. But then, more specifically, those forces like natural selection um, uh, gave us a sort of psychological predisposition to hold moral beliefs like the ones on the first list, as opposed to a predisposition to hold beliefs like the one on the second list. We find ourselves with this tendency to believe that it's good to help your children, that it's right to help your children, rather than that it's wrong to help your children, because like all of our other uh, uh, behavioral dispositions, psychological dispositions, uh, bodily features, all of the things we find ourselves with as a species because of evolutionary history. These things were selected for by evolution for its purposes over a long period of time. So that much should be relatively uncontroversial to say, that the genealogy of our tendency to believe we should help our children, for example, is a causal product of natural selection selecting for that predisposition. Well, Sharon Street says, look, that much should be uncontroversial, but now let's suppose you're a moral realist. So, moral realism is very roughly the view that, here's how she puts it, there are at least some moral facts or truths that hold independently of our moral beliefs. Um, so, moral realists say very roughly that the facts about what is right and wrong don't depend on us and don't depend on our recognizing them or believing them. So a moral realist might say that, we're objectively morally obligated to help our children whether we want to or not, whether we believe that that's the right thing to do or not. That's sort of the objective fact of the matter. Um, so we have, on the one hand, we have moral realism that says that uh, there are these mind independent, objective moral facts. And on the other, we have evolutionary forces that uh, directed or caused us to have certain moral beliefs rather than others. And Street's Darwinian dilemma is a question about the relationship between these two. So her question is why, or do the objective moral facts explain why evolution selected for beliefs like the belief that it's right to care for your children as opposed to the belief that it's wrong to care for your children? And there's two possible answers, right? Number one is that the objective moral facts play an explanatory role in why it is that evolution selected for certain moral beliefs rather than others. So, for example, the idea would be that evolution selected for the belief that it's right to care for your children because it's objectively right to care for your children, because it wanted to bring about beliefs that matched the mind dependent moral facts. The other horn of the dilemma, or the other option, is that there's no relationship at all between the evolutionary forces that shaped our moral beliefs on the one hand and the way the objective moral facts are on the other. So let's look at each of these two options in turn, and Street is going to argue that either way the moral realist goes, there are problems. So let's talk about the first horn of the dilemma, or the first option. Uh, for what it's worth, if you're interested, I'm actually presenting these horns of the dilemma in a different order than Street does. So she actually, her first horn is the second horn for me, and vice versa. I just think that I'm hoping that this way of setting it up is a little clearer. So what would option one mean? Well, she calls this the truth tracking account. On the truth tracking account, evolutionary forces selected for the beliefs we have really because those beliefs match the objective moral facts. You can think of evolution as, on this idea, aiming at bringing it about that we have accurate moral beliefs. The evolution really wants our minds to match moral reality. And Street's main objection to this idea is it's just not a very good scientific hypothesis. This presents itself as an explanation, as a scientific theory of some sort or scientific hypothesis. And Street's worry is this is just not a very good one. In particular, there's a better and a more empirically adequate empirical hypothesis about why it is that evolution would select for the belief, say, that it's good to help your children. It's not because there's an objective fact about it's being right to help your children, and evolution wanted to guide us toward that fact. That's not how evolution works. Instead, what she calls the adaptive link account says that evolutionary forces selected for, say, the belief that it's right to help your children, because those are the beliefs that tended to motivate fitness-enhancing behaviors. A fitness-enhancing behavior is just roughly a behavioral trait or disposition that makes it more likely that the organism will pass along its copies of its genes to the next generation. So what the adaptive link account says is that evolutionary forces really were primarily aiming at getting us human beings to do the things that we're more likely to pass on our genes. And the reason why it picked the predisposition to believe that it's right to help your children is that believing that it's right to help your children makes it more likely that you will do the things that pass along your genes to the next generation. Well, which things? Well, for example, protecting your children, right? So for mammals like us, if you want to pass on your genes, you, one, need to have the children, and then two, you need to make sure that those children are protected from predation. You need to feed them. You need to make sure that they are going to survive and have reproductive success. You therefore, it is a fitness enhancing behavior is the way we can put it, to help your children. It also, by the way, is a fitness enhancing behavior to help your other biological relatives. So this isn't the way it works for us, but it's pretty well known to be a good explanation of why honeybees will be willing to sometimes sacrifice themselves for the good of the hive. The reason is that the hive is genetically closely related to the bee that sacrifices itself. And one way to get a copy of your gene passed along to the next generation is through your children. Another way is through your sibling or your parents, if they are as closely genetically related to you as they are in the case of bees. There are other kinds of mechanisms that and other kinds of behaviors that matter here. So it is really a good thing from a fitness perspective if you are sometimes willing to cooperate with other animals of your species toward a common goal that no one of you could do on your own. So the lion that's willing to cooperate with the other lions to take down the water buffalo is more likely to get a meal and survive the next day. Another useful, from an evolutionary perspective, useful behavioral tendency is reciprocal altruism. So if you're willing to sometimes sacrifice a bit of time and energy to, in this case, in the picture here, pick the parasites out of the hair of the monkey sitting next to you, or the fur, then later on, when you're in need of a similar service, that monkey might help you in return. On the other hand, if you didn't help him, then that monkey might decide, well, I'm not going to help you out, which is not going to be useful for you. Another important feature, this is one is, from my understanding, empirically a little more tentative, but some evolutionary biologists have suggested that natural selection may operate not just at the individual level, but it may also select for groups as a whole. And the thought is something like this: groups of organisms that are quite cohesive and cooperative, where everybody's helping everyone else and looking out for everyone else, and willing to make some sacrifices, tend to be more effective at achieving their goals than groups that are infighting, groups that refuse to cooperate, groups with lots of unhelpful individuals. And when it comes to a competition for resources between two groups, if you are looking at one group that contains a lot of cooperative members and another group that contains very few cooperative members, the one to bet on to be the one to win out in that struggle is the one with lots of cooperative members. And so in that way, at the group level, cooperation really pays off. And if you're an individual, the best thing is for you to be, one, in a group of cooperative organisms of your species, and two, for you to play your part so that you can reap the benefits and not get punished by trying to cheat. So what does all of this have to do with moral beliefs? Because what I just listed there were a lot of what are sometimes called helping behaviors, some of which appear in non-human organisms. Non-human organisms practice reciprocal altruism, mutualism, and the protection of their offspring. In us, the reason that this matters for our ability to think morally, so Michael Roos, who is also an evolutionary debunker of morality, but of a different sort, he puts the point really nicely. Here's how he puts it. To make us cooperate for our biological ends, evolution has filled us full of thoughts about right and wrong, the need to help our fellows, and so on. Morality is that which our biology uses to promote altruism. So Roos's thought here is that the reason why evolution selected for the capacity to think in terms of ought and right and wrong is primarily because those kinds of thoughts are really good motivators for coming to reliably engage in helping behaviors. And helping behaviors, as we just saw, are, in the right context, very fitness enhancing. So here's one way to see this. Here are a couple of hominids depicted here carrying some fish, I guess. The hominid on the left says, "I like doing this," carrying along this fish over back to my tribe, I guess. And then the other one says, "I am morally required to do this." And think of it this way: which one of these is more likely, you think, to stop helping out with this behavior? The one that just thinks about the behavior in terms of, this is fun, I like this, or the one who thinks, I must do this, I'm required? And Street and other evolutionary debunkers point out that, well, of course, the one who thinks that they're morally required to help out, that one is going to be, you can kind of count on them. It's more likely that they will commit to helping out. The one that merely says, hey, I like helping out, is more likely to stop helping if the circumstances change. Maybe tomorrow they find themselves realizing I don't like that as much as I thought, or I'm tired and I don't want to do it anymore. If they don't think I'm obligated to do it, I must, there's an objective fact requiring me to, then they may just say, screw it, I don't want to do it anymore. Um, so that, in general, gives us a sense of why it is that evolution might have selected for the capacity to think of our own behaviors in moral terms. The thinking in terms of what's right and wrong is quite a bit more motivating than just thinking in terms of I like or I don't like. Morality has this quality that it gives us it has a purchase on us even when we don't want to do it. And so, in that way, the psychology of thinking morally sort of glues us to our altruistic behaviors in a much greater way than mere preference does. Um, well, that goes quite a bit of ways toward explaining why we would think morally. But why would we think specifically in terms of the more common moral belief list rather than the less common one? Why did evolution give us this predisposition to think I'm required to help my children, as opposed to I'm required to hurt my children, for example? And here it's pretty clear an early hominid that thought I'm morally required to hurt my children is definitely not going to let its children survive long enough for the child to pass along its genes. Whereas the early hominid that thinks I'm required to help my children will. And likewise, if you go down that list of common moral beliefs, the early hominid that thinks I'm required to, to reward those in my community who hurt others is more likely to reward people who are hurting others in their community, which is going to create or sort of pull at the social fabric and make that community less cohesive. Probably will get them in trouble too. Whereas the early hominid who thinks, I'm going to punish those who harm my friends, and I'm going to reward those who help my friends, that one is more likely to engage in the kind of cooperation with those in its immediate group that makes that group a better unit to achieve its goals, like taking down a woolly mammoth or whatever to explain. So, okay, what if we just go with the adaptive link account and we say, okay, evolution wasn't aiming at giving us true moral beliefs. The reason why we got the belief that it's morally right to help your children is simply because that redounded to the fitness of our ancestors. End of story. Why is that supposed to be a problem? The first horn was a problem because it was scientifically inadequate. And the second horn, Street says, well, let's, moral realist, let's suppose that evolution selected for this moral belief that you ought to help your children, but for reasons that have nothing to do with whether it's objectively right to help your children. In other words, let's just suppose that there's no explanatory role at all for objective. So that's the first horn of Street's dilemma. The other horn, the second horn, is let's imagine the moral realist says, no, the objective facts about what's right and wrong play no role at all in the evolutionary process. Evolution's not like aiming to give us moral beliefs that match the objective moral facts. That's not what's going on. Evolution gave us the belief that it's, morally right to help your children for reasons that have nothing to do with whether it's actually objectively morally right to help your children or not. Instead, we had that belief entirely because it was advantageous for our ancestors to have that belief for fitness purposes. This is the second option. And big picture, Street says, look, the problem with going this route for the realist is that if evolution was not selecting for the moral beliefs we have in order to give us true moral beliefs, then how can we be at all confident that the moral beliefs we have correspond with what is objectively morally right? I mean, if they did, it would be a miraculous coincidence, wouldn't it? Um, you know, it would be like shooting an arrow just randomly, sort of out into the blue, and just happening to hit a bullseye. Like, could that happen? Sure, it could, but it's fantastically unlikely. And likewise, if evolution was not aiming to give us moral beliefs that corresponded with or matched the objective facts about what's right and wrong, then for all we know, it could be that what is objectively right is to harm your children. And we nevertheless would believe, precisely because evolution endowed us with this belief, that it's right to help your children. For all we know, that could be the way things went. I mean, evolution was not aiming to give us true beliefs on this option. Street gives us this analogy to help motivate the worry she has about the second horn of her dilemma. Um, Allowing our moral judgments to be shaped by evolutionary influences is analogous to setting out for Bermuda and letting the course of your boat be determined by the wind and the tides. Just as the push of the wind and tides on your boat has nothing to do with where you want to go, so the historical push of natural selection on the content of our moral beliefs has nothing to do with the moral truth. Every now and then, she says, the wind and tides might happen to deposit someone's boat on the shores of Bermuda. Similarly, every now and then, Darwinian pressures might have happened to push us toward moral truths. But this would be purely a matter of chance. So, Street's concern here is that if moral realism is true and the objective moral facts are independent of our moral beliefs, and furthermore, independent of the forces that guided our moral beliefs, it would be a matter of random coincidence if evolution happened to push us toward what is objectively the right moral beliefs. Wouldn't it be a random accident, a happy coincidence, if indeed evolution had bestowed upon us the beliefs that happen to be true, despite not trying to give us the beliefs that happen to be true? Now, you can see from the analogy she's giving, and as she says here, it's not impossible that evolution might do that. It's just very unlikely. It's as unlikely as it would be setting out for Bermuda in a little boat without sails or a compass, and just hoping that the random winds and tides were going to eventually deposit you on the shores of Bermuda. Could that happen? Of course. But it's incredibly unlikely, and you obviously are not justified in an epistemic sense in believing that this would happen. In another work that on the Darwinian dilemma, another later article, she gives another analogy that's also helpful. So suppose that you have gone through life, or at least recently, you've believed that Rutherford B. Hayes is the 20th president of the United States, and you mention this casually to a friend, who then starts to chuckle, and you're like, "Why are you laughing?" And they say, "Well, last week while we were out late, there was a hypnotist guy there, and he hypnotized you, and he implanted in you this belief about who the 20th president was." And you're like, "Oh, that's really weird. Was the hypnotist expert in U.S. history? Was he trying to give me true beliefs?" And your friend is like, "No, he was completely historically illiterate, and he was just doing it for fun. He just completely guessed and implanted this belief in you." It would, of course, then be very improbable, you should think, that your U.S. president belief is true, given its causal origins, given that it originated in a process that wasn't aiming at giving you the truth about who the president is. Could it be the case that the hypnotist just happened on the right to assign the right president to the right number? Could be. Very unlikely, though, and you shouldn't continue holding your president belief. You have, in other words, what is sometimes called a defeater for that belief. Crucially, that defeater came from a genealogy or a causal explanation of how you came to hold the belief. So now swap out the details and imagine you're a moral realist who's going through your life thinking, it's objectively morally right for me to take care of my children. And then you encounter the fact that, my moral beliefs, just like everyone else's, were crucially shaped by the evolutionary process that itself was not in any way related to the objective moral facts, wasn't aiming at giving us moral facts, at giving us true moral beliefs, wasn't in any way pushed by what the objective moral facts are. You should then stop believing that your moral beliefs are true. Again, it could be that they're true, but given the way they originated, it is incredibly improbable that your moral beliefs are true. Just in the way that given what you've learned about the way your president belief originated, it is incredibly improbable that that belief is true. So we can now sort of lay out the full dilemma that Sharon Street is pushing on the moral realist. We had this question: why is it that evolutionary forces bestowed upon us the belief that it is right to help your children, the belief that it's good to help those who help you, and so on, as opposed to the competing set of beliefs like it's good to help your children? Why did evolution give us this disposition? If I'm a moral realist, I believe in a realm of mind-independent moral facts about what is objectively right and wrong. And Street says, I then, a moral realist, need to take a stand. What's the relationship between those alleged objective moral facts and the pressures that gave me and other humans our moral beliefs? Either there's an explanatory role for the objective moral facts. For example, either evolution gave us those moral beliefs because it was aiming at getting us to the objective moral truths, or there's no explanatory role in the evolutionary process for objective moral facts. That is, evolution was not aiming to give us moral beliefs because they're objectively true, but for some other unrelated reason. Street argues that on the first horn of the dilemma, the realist is committed to a scientifically untenable and needlessly complex hypothesis about evolutionary history, according to which objective moral facts played a role somehow, when we don't need to invoke those. All we need to invoke is that having moral beliefs of a particular sort were fitness enhancing. The other horn lands the realist in the result that they have to be skeptical about the truth of their moral beliefs, which is a way of effectively then being skeptical about the truth of their realism at all. So therefore, Street thinks that no matter which direction the realist goes, the evolutionary genealogy of our moral capacity and the particular moral beliefs we have will lead them either to embrace an empirically unappealing hypothesis, or it's going to lead them to be committed to rationally giving up their moral beliefs. Either result is quite bad. And if you want, according to Street, if you want to both have a plausible empirical story about how it is that we came to have these moral beliefs, and also not be a skeptic, that is, also hang on to your belief that it's right to help your children, Street says the thing to do is to give up moral realism. According to her, we make the moral facts, so to speak, by believing in them. as opposed to the other way around. Now, there's a lot more to say uh, about Street's dilemma and different ways the realist could possibly respond. I invite you to think for yourself about this. Um, I will say I think it's an interesting question whether moral realists who are also non naturalists, that is, who believe that the moral properties are in some way distinct from underlying empirically detectable natural properties, that kind of moral realist arguably has a much more difficult time with this dilemma than a more naturalistic approach to realistically construed moral properties. Your author, Russ Schaefer Landau, is of the non naturalistic moral realist bent. And so, arguably, he may have a particularly difficult time responding to Street's dilemma.